The issue of succession became the defining concern of Carlos's entire reign, as it became increasingly clear that he would never produce an heir. Attempts to find a wife capable of continuing the Habsburg line turned into desperate efforts. Yet the severity of the king's health problems doomed these efforts from the start. European intelligence agencies, aware that his death would trigger a major succession crisis, closely monitored Carlos's health and reproductive status. Even the most intimate details of his marriage became strategically significant information. Medical interventions grew increasingly desperate as well, from exotic medicines to experimental treatments and even surgical procedures. Numerous methods were attempted, yet none achieved significant results. These repeated failures exposed the monarchy's inability to resolve the fundamental genetic problems that were destroying the royal family and became symbols of its helplessness. The cost of Carlos's treatments became a tremendous financial burden. Throughout his reign, astronomical sums were spent in the hope of restoring the king's health and fertility. This represented not only economic waste, but also a symbolic acknowledgement of the Spanish monarchy's dependence on external solutions to address internal, hereditary problems. The final years of Carlos II's reign, ending with his death in 1700, marked the ultimate collapse of the Spanish Habsburg's genetic experiment. The king's death, without an heir, triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that confirmed the end of the dynasty and ushered in a new era under the Bourbon family. European powers had long prepared for this moment, with succession plans and military strategies ready to be deployed. The crisis that had begun with the Habsburgs' obsession with blood purity ultimately led to an international war and a fundamental reshaping of Europe's political balance. The legacy of this genetic experiment extended far beyond its political consequences. The downfall of one of the world's most powerful families provided scientists with vital evidence of the dangers of inbreeding. These events became foundational to modern understanding of genetic inheritance and the role of genetic diversity in population health. Modern genetic analyses have largely confirmed historical observations. Research has identified specific genetic mutations that accumulated over successive generations of cousin marriages within the Habsburg lineage, providing concrete evidence for theories proposed by contemporary observers. This case served as a warning to other European dynasties. Once the dangers of the Habsburgs' approach became clear, many royal families abandoned the idea of blood purity and pursued marriage strategies that increased genetic diversity. Educational and scientific institutions began using the Habsburg case as a teaching tool to illustrate the importance of genetic diversity. A dynasty once seen as the pinnacle of power and prestige became a textbook example of genetic failure, a tragic story serving as a living warning to future generations about the risks of systematic inbreeding. The architectural and artistic legacy of the Habsburgs also became part of this historical lesson. The grand palaces, churches, and monumental structures built during their reign stand not only as symbols of imperial wealth, but also as reminders of the human cost of the genetic collapse that destroyed their empire. Preserved palaces and historical sites now function like open-air museums, offering insight into how royal life was intertwined with the unfolding genetic crisis. Museum collections of Habsburg portraits, personal artifacts, and medical records provide valuable information about the progression of the dynasty's genetic decline. These materials help historians and researchers understand how the deterioration was documented, concealed, and ultimately accepted as an unavoidable reality. The Habsburgs' medical records are invaluable sources for historians studying the interplay of politics, religion, and science in the early modern period. They reveal how genetic diseases were understood and treated before the advent of modern medicine, offering key insights into the medical thinking of the 17th century. Today, the Habsburg example has transcended historical curiosity to become a central reference point in debates on genetic engineering, reproductive technologies, and bioethics. This case represents a natural experiment in human genetics, demonstrating both the potential benefits and the profound risks of attempting to manipulate human inheritance. Medical geneticists continue to scrutinize the Habsburg case as a way to understand how genetic disorders accumulate in isolated populations. Modern research based on data from this dynasty has deepened our knowledge of genetic counseling, reproductive health, and the role of genetic screening in preventing hereditary diseases. Educational institutions also used this story not merely as a history lesson, but as a case study to teach the complex relationship between science, ideology, and political power. The genetic crisis experienced by the Habsburgs starkly illustrates how political dogmas can suppress scientific understanding and how ideological commitments can prevent societies from confronting medical realities. Genetic experiment of the Spanish Habsburgs stands as one of the most striking examples in history of the unintended consequences of politicizing human reproduction. What began as a strategy to preserve political power ultimately evolved into a systematic process of genetic destruction that brought down one of the most powerful dynasties in the world. The tragedy of Princess Margarita Teresa and King Carlos II serves as a lasting reminder of how vital genetic diversity is and how devastating it can be to build ideological obsessions on top of biological realities. The meticulous documentation of their suffering has provided modern society with crucial insights into the connection between genetic health and social organization. The fall of the Habsburg dynasty marked the end of an era in European history, revealing that even the most powerful political institutions are ultimately vulnerable to biological limitations. A family that once shaped European politics fell not to wars or popular revolutions, but to the genetic consequences of its own marriage policies. The lessons drawn from this case remain relevant today, as advances in reproductive technologies and genetic engineering present both promising and perilous possibilities for manipulating human genetics. The Habsburg example offers a vital historical perspective. Preserving genetic diversity and avoiding ideological extremism are among the most important lessons to emerge from this dramatic experiment of the past. In the end, the Spanish Habsburgs carved their monument not in stone or bronze but into their very genetic code. Every cell of their lineage carried the consequences of centuries of marriage policies and bore the marks of a self-destructive ambition. Their story serves as both a tragic warning and a profound lesson when humanity attempts to transcend the limits of biology. With political ideology or dynastic ambition, it will inevitably be forced to confront the immutable laws of nature. The dreadful stench emanating from Princess Margarita Teresa's body was not merely a medical symptom, it was a symbol of an empire rotting from within. Her brother Carlos's struggles to speak, walk, and think were not just personal challenges. They were the outward manifestations of the collapse of an entire political system. Together, the two siblings represented the final chapter of a multi-generational experiment, one that ultimately destroyed the very reason for its existence. The noble blood the Habsburgs had worked so hard to preserve ultimately became their poison. The empire built through strategic marriages crumbled beneath the weight of its own genetic inheritance. Their story is an eternal reminder that power without wisdom, ideology without science, and tradition without adaptation are doomed to fail, leaving behind only the bitter lessons learned too late by those who paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' hubris. Rumors circulated among the public, ranging from supernatural curses to foreign conspiracies. Yet more and more people began questioning the fundamental pillars of their political system. The gap between the rhetoric of divine authority and the visible reality of royal incapacity had grown too wide to ignore, sparking new debates about the source of legitimacy and the nature of power. Spanish literature and art of the period reflected this unease, though always in subtle language that avoided direct criticism of the monarchy. Court painters faced the challenge of producing official portraits that upheld royal dignity while acknowledging their subjects' obvious physical deformities. The resulting works formed a nearly surreal iconography that sought to present clearly disabled individuals as symbols of power and authority. Traces of this crisis of confidence also appeared in religious art and architecture. Churches commissioned works emphasizing themes of suffering, redemption, and divine mystery, reflecting the public's attempts to reconcile the contradiction between royal claims of divine favor and the physical realities of their rulers. One dimension of the Baroque art movement that flourished in 17th century Spain can be seen as a cultural response to these fundamental questions. Spanish nobles, who traditionally modeled their behavior on royal example, also entered a period of uncertainty. As the Habsburg genetic crisis became more apparent, aristocratic marriage practices, long influenced by the monarchy, came under scrutiny. Many noble families had adopted similar intermarriage strategies to preserve their bloodlines and political power. As evidence of the destructive consequences of such practices mounted, these families faced a dilemma: continue imitating the crown and risk their own genetic health, or break with tradition and risk losing royal favor. Different families responded in different ways. Some continued marrying within their extended families, while others sought alliances with foreign noble houses that offered greater genetic diversity. The Spanish military's response revealed the practical consequences of the crisis. Commanders and naval officers responsible for defending a global empire were forced to operate within a command structure led by monarchs whose cognitive and physical limitations severely hampered strategic planning. This situation led experienced officers to assume responsibilities that should normally have belonged to royal commanders, resulting in the emergence of informal power structures that contradicted the official military hierarchy. The spread of information about the Habsburg family's health had a profound impact on international perceptions of Spain's military capabilities. Foreign strategists recognized that the nation's highest military authority was now in the hands of individuals incapable of effective command, and this realization increasingly shaped European strategic planning around Spain's growing weakness. The legendary reputation of the Spanish military, built over centuries of successful campaigns, began to crumble as reports of the royal family's physical and mental incapacities circulated through diplomatic channels. The economic consequences of the Habsburg genetic crisis extended far beyond the cost of medical treatments. Spain's complex trade and colonial systems relied on strategic decision-making processes that became increasingly difficult to manage as the royal family's mental capacity declined. Trade policies, colonial administration, and financial regulation were all severely affected by this governance failure. As the royal court's focus shifted from state affairs to health concerns, merchants and colonial administrators were forced to operate with almost no guidance from the center. This led to inconsistent policies, missed opportunities, and growing advantages for rival powers. The Spanish bureaucracy, once the envy of all Europe, also began to lose its effectiveness. As royal authority lost its coordinating power, institutional efficiency declined. Rival powers such as England, France, and the Netherlands built sophisticated economic intelligence networks, systematically analyzing Spain's weaknesses and developing strategies to undermine its dominance in global trade. The consequences in the colonies were even more severe. Spanish territories in the Americas and Asia required strong central support to maintain their loyalty to the crown. However, as royal power weakened, colonial administrators began to act with greater independence, creating opportunities for foreign intervention and local uprisings that accelerated the empire's decline. Marriage negotiations involving Margarita Teresa and Carlos turned into exercises in diplomatic deception that revealed just how much the royal family's genetic condition had weakened Spanish foreign policy. Ambassadors knew that most royal family members were unsuitable marriage partners for foreign dynasties from a health perspective, but openly acknowledging this would damage Spain's prestige. Instead, marriage treaties increasingly included complex financial incentives to offset the genetic risks associated with the Habsburg bloodline. The size of dowries grew rapidly as the royal family paid vast sums to secure marriage alliances. Despite genetic concerns, however, these financial commitments provided only short-term gains and placed a heavy strain on the state treasury. Foreign courts, meanwhile, established detailed intelligence networks to monitor the health and reproductive capabilities of the Spanish royal family. Marriage negotiations became opportunities for espionage, as ambassadors and agents collected medical information to inform their government's strategic planning. The most private details of the royal family's health had become a matter of diplomatic analysis. The failure of these marriages to produce healthy offspring caused diplomatic problems for Spain's allies. Nations tied to a dynasty in genetic decline began to reconsider their relationships. Treaties originally intended to forge long-term alliances became liabilities as partners sought ways to distance themselves from the Spanish royal family without openly breaking their commitments. Margarita Teresa died in 1673 at just 21 years old. Although official records attributed her death to various medical complications, contemporaries knew she was a victim of the systematic genetic collapse caused by generations of inbreeding. Her death removed one of the most visible symbols of the Habsburgs' decline, and extinguished any hope that healthy heirs might continue the royal line. Princess's funeral became a somber farewell to a life whose destiny had been sealed from birth. Lavish ceremonies sought to obscure the fact that her death was regarded by many at court as a form of relief. Clergy used the occasion to deliver sermons about divine will and the importance of accepting fate, carefully avoiding any mention of the human decisions that had contributed to the tragedy. International reactions revealed how closely foreign courts had been monitoring the Habsburg genetic crisis. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows that Margarita Teresa's death was seen by many governments as confirmation of their theories about the dynasty's decline and as an opportunity to accelerate preparations for the impending succession crisis. Post-mortem medical examinations, though limited by the scientific understanding of the time, revealed clear evidence of hereditary degeneration in the Habsburg bloodline. Court physicians documented multiple organ abnormalities and developmental disorders, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand their genetic origins. Carlos's accession to the throne in 1665 as King Charles II created an unprecedented situation in European history. A vast empire ruled by a monarch whose cognitive and physical impairments rendered him incapable of effective governance. The early years of his reign were marked by regency arrangements and intense power struggles among court factions, all conducted under the pretense that the king was capable of ruling, even though everyone knew he was not. Court protocols were completely reorganized to compensate for the king's limitations, with elaborate ceremonial structures created to prevent the public from realizing how dysfunctional the monarchy had become. State ceremonies were meticulously planned so that Carlos would not need to speak or demonstrate any cognitive ability. His role was often reduced to a purely symbolic presence. Although foreign relations were conducted under the nominal supervision of royal authority, real decisions were now made by a complex network of advisors, ministers, and influential court figures. Foreign ambassadors quickly adapted to this informal power structure, realizing that actual political control rested in the hands of individuals who held no official authority. However, it soon became apparent that Margarita Teresa was not the healthy, vibrant princess the Spanish court had hoped for. Contemporary accounts describe a child who struggled with basic physical development and lacked the energy and vitality expected of royal offspring. As the years went on, her condition became more pronounced, manifesting in ways that shocked even the most experienced courtiers. One of the most disturbing aspects was the terrible odor surrounding her, described by witnesses as so intense it could be detected from afar. This was not the result of poor hygiene or inadequate care. It was a clear sign of internal decay. Court physicians tried everything from herbal remedies to exotic spices, but nothing worked. The smell became the defining feature of the princess's existence. The impact on court life was immediate. Her presence was reduced at social events where she would normally have taken center stage. Diplomatic receptions were carefully choreographed to minimize contact with her while still preserving the appearance of respect for royal protocol. Even the structure of court ceremonies had to be redesigned around her condition. Personal writings from courtiers and servants provide heartbreaking details of Margarita Teresa's tragedy. The princess was reportedly aware of her condition and the discomfort it caused others, which drove her into increasing isolation. The young woman who should have been at the center of Spanish high society instead found herself pushed to the margins, a situation that deepened both her physical and emotional suffering. Marriage negotiations, a routine part of royal life, began early for Margarita Teresa. However, her health issues created unprecedented obstacles for Spanish diplomats. Potential suitors, initially attracted by the political advantages of an alliance with Spain, withdrew their interest once they learned of her condition. This left Spanish negotiators in an impossible position. They needed to conceal crucial information to secure alliances. But the truth would inevitably become apparent. The birth of the princess's younger brother, Carlos, in 1661, would expose the decline of the Habsburg bloodline even more dramatically. From birth, it was clear that Carlos suffered from severe disabilities that would shape his entire life. He was unable to walk until the age of 4, struggled with speech throughout his life, and displayed profound cognitive impairments that made it nearly impossible for him to understand the complexities of governance. Carlos's physical appearance became the subject of both ridicule and horror in European courts. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a genetic trait passed down through generations, reached its most extreme form in him. His lower jaw protruded so far forward, and his tongue was so large, that closing his mouth, eating and speaking were extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses also described a boy with a disproportionately large head, short stature, and limbs that failed to coordinate properly. He appeared to suffer from epilepsy, with seizures becoming more frequent and severe as he aged. His health was so fragile that court physicians lived in constant fear he might die at any moment, potentially leaving Spain without an heir. Mental disabilities compounded Carlos's physical problems. He displayed what modern medicine would classify as severe cognitive delay, struggling to learn basic skills and completely unable to grasp the complex political and economic challenges facing the Spanish Empire. Yet court protocol demanded that he be raised and educated as the future king. This led to a bizarre and largely futile educational process, with tutors attempting to teach statecraft to someone who could barely manage his own personal care. The gulf between Spain's urgent political situation and the limited abilities of its future monarch deepened the pervasive sense of impending disaster throughout the court. The consequences of these personal tragedies extended far beyond the royal family. Spain faced growing threats from rival European powers, colonial uprisings, and economic crises that required decisive leadership and strategic thinking. Yet the country was ruled by Philip IV himself, a product of inbreeding, and would soon be governed by a successor incapable of performing even the most basic functions of kingship. Foreign intelligence agencies became increasingly focused on the question of Spanish succession, realizing that Carlos's death without an heir would create a power vacuum capable of reshaping the European balance of power. French, Austrian, and English diplomats built networks of spies in Madrid to gather detailed information about the king's health and his chances of producing an heir. These intelligence operations would ultimately play decisive roles in the complex diplomatic maneuvering that followed Carlos's death. The royal family's attempts to resolve their health problems laid bare the limitations of medicine and the dangerous intersection of religion, politics, and science. The most skilled physicians of the era were completely helpless in the face of genetic disorders that would not be scientifically understood for another 2 centuries. Treatments ranging from bloodletting to exotic herbal mixtures were not only ineffective but often worsened the patient's conditions. As medical approaches continued to fail, religious explanations for the royal family's suffering gained increasing importance. Spanish Catholic theology offered various frameworks for interpreting this affliction, from divine punishment for sins to spiritual tests meant to prove the dynasty's fitness to rule. These theological perspectives conveniently ignored the possibility that the crisis might have been caused by human decisions. Specifically, the royal family's marriage policies, exorcisms, and other spiritual interventions also became common. When Carlos's seizures and other neurological symptoms were interpreted as signs of demonic possession, these ceremonies, attended by high-ranking clergy, turned into public spectacles showcasing the royal family's piety and raising hopes that supernatural forces might succeed where medicine had failed. The involvement of the Inquisition further complicated matters. Ever vigilant against heresy and witchcraft, the Inquisition put forward numerous theories about the causes of the royal illnesses, including the possibility that enemy states had cursed the Habsburg bloodline. These investigations were mostly fruitless, but fueled an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that made it even harder to focus on the real causes of the crisis. Foreign physicians were occasionally consulted, but their ability to provide effective solutions was severely limited by both the primitive state of medical knowledge and the political sensitivities surrounding royal health. Any foreign doctor who hinted that the royal marriage practices might be at the root of the family's health issues risked being accused of espionage or heresy, which effectively limited medical consultations to those who adhered strictly to the prevailing ideological line. The economic burden of royal healthcare also grew steadily. State resources were diverted from other critical areas to finance increasingly complex and expensive treatments. Exotic medicines were imported from across the world. Foreign specialists were brought in, and comprehensive treatment plans were implemented, yet no significant improvement was achieved. These expenditures represented not only a financial strain, but also a symbolic admission of the dynasty's fragility. Alternative sources of medical knowledge, such as Islamic and Jewish medicine, once available in Spain, were systematically excluded for religious and political reasons. This further reduced the already slim chances of effective treatment, cutting off access to some of the most advanced medical approaches of the period. The condition of the royal family had profound psychological effects on Spanish society. People who had been taught to view their rulers as God's representatives on earth now faced a crisis of faith that went far beyond the question of succession. If God had truly chosen the Habsburgs to rule Spain, why were they afflicted with suffering that seemed like divine punishment? In the sweltering summer days of 1680, whispers echoing through the marble corridors of the royal palace of Madrid foretold the arrival of a secret that would shake not only Spain but all of Europe. Behind gilded doors and beneath crystal chandeliers, a truth was silently taking root, one that would rot the most powerful dynasty in Europe from within. This was not a story of war or revolution. It was something far more insidious. The story of a dynasty that believed itself divinely chosen, slowly destroyed by its own blood. What you are about to hear will overturn everything you thought you knew about royal power and reveal just how heavy the cost of absolute authority can be. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled Spain for more than 2 centuries. Their dominion extended across the Atlantic, governing lands from the Americas to the Philippines. Wealth from the New World flowed into the kingdom like rivers of gold, and European politics bent to their will. But by 1680, this vast empire was teetering on the edge of decay. What was slowly bringing them down was neither an invasion nor a rebellion. It was something far more dangerous and internal: their own obsessions. The Habsburgs had become victims of their own belief that blood was more valuable than health, that purity was more precious than life itself. Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain should have been the dazzling jewel of European royalty, born into unimaginable wealth and privilege. Kings from across the continent lined up to seek her hand in marriage, but she instead became the symbol of the dynasty's downfall. Courtiers could not bear to be near her. Even the most seasoned servants fled her presence, unable to tolerate the stench. This was no ordinary illness. Witnesses described an odor that seemed to emanate from within, the physical manifestation of decay, a tangible consequence of generations of mistakes. Margarita Teresa did not suffer this fate alone. Her brother, Carlos II, heir to the Spanish throne, inherited not only the crown, but also a body ravaged by genetic disorders. He was so weak and frail that he could barely function as a human being, let alone as a ruler. These 2 siblings represented the final act of one of history's most powerful dynasties. Their very existence was living proof of the catastrophe caused by centuries of dynastic inbreeding. The Habsburg family tree now resembled a laboratory experiment more than a royal lineage. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and the same gene pool cycling endlessly through generations. What had begun as a political strategy to preserve power had, over time, transformed into an unconscious program of genetic annihilation. In their obsession with preserving their bloodline, the dynasty had effectively engineered its own end. This obsession with blood purity was not unique to Spain, but nowhere else was it pursued so rigidly, so obsessively, and ultimately so destructively. The Spanish Habsburgs pushed the idea to its most extreme conclusion, creating a bloodline so inbred and damaged that it could no longer sustain itself. In short, they had bred themselves out of existence, and in doing so, dragged an empire to its grave. The year 1680 was a turning point not only for Spain but for the very concept of monarchy across Europe. As Margarita Teresa's condition worsened and her brother Carlos struggled to govern, foreign courts began to circle like vultures, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The Habsburg power that had once struck fear into its enemies was now observed with pity and grim anticipation. The history of royal marriage stretched back to the Middle Ages, when European rulers discovered that marriage was not just about love, but also a political tool. At first, the strategy worked perfectly. Territorial integrity was maintained, wealth remained concentrated within small dynastic circles, and alliances were strengthened. The idea that royal blood was sacred gave this practice a religious legitimacy as well. The Habsburgs elevated this strategy to an unprecedented level. Through meticulously planned marriages, they built a global empire, controlling trade routes, colonies, and armies. Their motto, Belligerant Ali, to Felix, Austria Nubi, let others wage war, you, happy Austria. Marry was a proud declaration of their use of matrimony as a tool of conquest. But hidden within this strategy was a fatal flaw. As the dynasty's power grew, it increasingly withdrew from external noble bloodlines and turned inward. A belief in their superiority took hold, leading them to marry only close relatives. When Emperor Charles V divided his empire into Spanish and Austrian branches, the Spanish Habsburg line became the most obsessed with blood purity. Unlike their Austrian cousins, who occasionally married outside the family, the Spanish Habsburgs saw diluting their bloodline as a betrayal of God. This decision would become their greatest mistake. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish Habsburg family tree resembled a closed loop rather than a branching lineage. Cousin marriages became common, and genetic diversity disappeared. The results were devastating: birth defects, intellectual disabilities, and physical deformities. Yet instead of seeing these as warnings, the family interpreted them as tests from God, problems to be solved with prayer or medicine. Court physicians shared the blame. Afraid of contradicting royal ideology, they remained silent even as they observed mounting genetic problems. They attempted bloodletting and exotic remedies to buy time, while the real cause remained unaddressed. The Catholic Church also played a role in perpetuating the cycle. Deeply intertwined with the Spanish crown, the Church declared that God had chosen the Habsburgs to rule, giving divine approval to the idea of preserving blood purity. Thus, the cycle of destruction gained a religious shield. Even the slightest suggestion that these marriages might be harmful was branded as heresy, effectively silencing the few voices that could have warned of the impending catastrophe before they even emerged. By the early 17th century, diplomats, especially those from rival nations, had begun to notice the deteriorating condition of the Spanish royal family. Venetian ambassadors, French court observers, and English envoys sent detailed reports to their governments describing the physical and mental decline they witnessed in Madrid. These reports, preserved in diplomatic archives, are today considered some of the most important evidence of the Habsburgs' genetic crisis. The birth of Princess Margarita Teresa in 1651 was initially celebrated as a major triumph for the dynasty. She was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, a union that perfectly embodied the family's obsessive determination to keep their bloodline pure. The princess was fourth in line to the throne and immediately regarded as one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Europe. A marriage to her could open the door to powerful political alliances,